Welcome to our story. Tonight, we explore what life was truly like for the ordinary people of Rome under Caesar. So, find your favorite spot to rest, let your shoulders relax, and allow the day's worries to simply drift away. There is nothing for you to do right now but listen. Just breathe in and out. Where are you listening from this evening? Is it late at night, or are you stealing a quiet moment in the middle of a perfectly managed or perfectly chaotic day? Wherever you are, I am glad you are here. If these stories help you unwind, consider following along for more journeys into the past. Now, let us go back together to a city of marble and whispers. Our guide is a young scribe, Lucius. He believes that to understand a great man, you must first understand the small lives he changes. With his stylus and wax tablet, he walks the crowded streets, where vendors shout their prices and travelers stop frequently for water, eager to begin. My scholarly patron, a man whose quiet generosity funded my life's work, had given me a task of immense weight. Lucius, he had said, his voice as soft as the unrolling of a fine papyrus scroll, I want you to write of our time, not of the great battles or the grand speeches, for others will do that. I want you to capture the life of Rome as it is, day by day, under the guidance of Caesar. And so, with a satchel of freshly prepared wax tablets and a sharpened bronze stylus, I began my great project in the very heart of the world, the Roman Forum. This great open space, framed by grand temples and the towering columns of law courts, felt like the only place to start. It was the city's pulse, and I was here to place my fingers upon it. The morning was bright, and I had to shield my eyes as I walked across the vast expanse of marble paving stones. My first stop was near the Temple of Saturn, where the money changers had set up their heavy wooden tables. A sharp, metallic clinking filled my ears as men from every province argued exchange rates. I approached a merchant, a man whose face was tanned the color of olive wood as he counted a stack of silver coins. I introduced myself, explaining my work as a historian seeking to document the prosperity of the city. He smiled a wide, agreeable smile. Prosperity? Yes, we have it in abundance, he declared, his voice loud enough for his neighbors to hear. Caesar has made the roads safe for trade and the seas free of pirates. Business has never been better. He gestured to his overflowing coin bags as proof. But when I asked how the new taxes affected his profits, his smile tightened. He simply repeated that the city was secure, his eyes briefly flicking toward the distant Curia, the Senate house where all laws were made. This kind of guarded response became the rhythm of my morning. I moved from the money changers to the craftsmen who sold fine pottery and lamps under the shade of the Basilica Aemilia, a magnificent public hall. Their answers were just as polished as their wares. A potter praised the new building projects Caesar had commissioned, saying they provided steady work for all. He spoke in rehearsed, perfect sentences, as if he were delivering a speech he had practiced many times. But when I asked about the cost of clay from the riverbeds, or if the guilds, the associations of craftsmen, felt their old freedoms were respected, his enthusiasm cooled. He would simply shrug and say, "Caesar provides," before turning his attention to another customer, leaving me to stare at my own reflection in a glazed pot. It was clear that the official heart of Rome was only prepared to offer me the official story. My next attempt was with a food vendor, a cheerful woman selling roasted chickpeas that sent a wonderfully savory aroma wafting toward me. For a small coin, she gave me a handful in a twist of parchment. The chickpeas were warm and salty, a simple pleasure. "Surely life is good for you," I began, gesturing to the long line of customers. "Your food is excellent." She laughed, a genuine, hearty sound. "The gods are good, and the grain ships arrive on time," she said. "We thank Caesar for that." It was the same refrain I had heard all morning. Hoping for something more, I asked about her family, about her children's futures. Her face became a careful, blank mask. "They will be good citizens of Rome," she said flatly, her warm tone gone. Her eyes, like the merchant's, darted for a moment toward the symbols of power that surrounded us before she busied herself with her roasting pan. The conversation was over. Feeling a bit discouraged, I sat on the steps of the Temple of Castor and Pollux to gather my thoughts. Before me, the forum was a grand performance. Senators in their white togas swept by, their assistants carrying bundles of documents. Lawyers argued cases with dramatic gestures, their voices echoing from the colonnades. It was a place of pronouncements and public declarations, not quiet truths. I looked down at my wax tablets. The smooth, cool surface felt inviting under my hand, but my stylus had barely moved. All I had inscribed were a few lines of empty praise, the sort of thing any politician might say. This was not the history my patron had asked for. It was a monument's inscription, not the story of the people who lived in its shadow. My training as a scholar had taught me to seek out primary sources, to ask direct questions and record the answers precisely. I had always believed this method was the purest path to understanding the past. Now, for the first time, I felt a seed of doubt. Here, my direct questions were not tools for uncovering truth. They were walls that sprung up between me and the people I spoke with. Their politeness was a form of armor, their praise a kind of shield. I began to understand that in a city where one man held so much power, public words were chosen with extreme care. Fear was not a loud, screaming thing. It was a quiet, watchful presence that guided every conversation in this grand open space. While I sat there, a quirky thought occurred to me. The city's stray dogs, those scruffy and clever creatures, were probably better historians than I was. They wandered everywhere, unseen and unheard, into the kitchens and alleys where real life happened. They listened to unguarded arguments and knew who was feasting and who was starving. I almost chuckled at the image of myself, a respectable scholar trying to learn the ways of a stray dog. Yet there was a grain of truth in the idea. The formal methods I had brought with me were useless here. My academic confidence, so strong in the quiet libraries I was used to, felt like a foolish kind of pride in this complex, living city. A strange detail caught my eye as I looked over the bustling plaza. Even the pigeons seemed to behave differently here. In the market squares of my youth, they would land in a flurry, fighting over every dropped crumb. Here in the forum, they seemed more reserved, walking with a strange dignity between the columns, as if they too were aware of being on a grand stage. Perhaps I was just letting my frustration color my observations, but it felt as if the entire atmosphere was one of careful performance. Everyone, from the senator to the chickpea vendor, even the birds, seemed to be playing a part. My work was to get behind the curtain, and I was failing completely. As the day wore on, my movements grew sluggish, and I found the shade of the great buildings more and more precious. I made one last attempt, approaching a group of stonemasons who were repairing a section of the Via Sacra, the main street through the Forum. These were hard-working men, their arms and tunics dusty with marble powder. I asked them about their craft, a topic on which they spoke with pride. But when I shifted the conversation toward their wages or the new overseers appointed by Caesar's government, a familiar silence fell. One of them wiped sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused hand and said, "It is good, steady work. We are grateful." I knew then that my day in the Forum was over. That evening, back in my small rented room, I held the tablets in my hands. Their weight felt far greater than simple wood and wax. It was the weight of my failure. I had spent an entire day in the busiest place on earth and had learned nothing of substance. The pages were filled with hollow echoes, not the vibrant, complex sounds of real life. My great project, which had begun with such idealistic energy, now seemed impossible. I had approached Rome through its front door, only to find it, politely but firmly, shut in my face. This realization led to a new sense of clarity. The history my patron wanted, the story of the Roman people, was not to be found among these marble monuments to power. It was not in the rehearsed speeches of merchants or the careful praise of vendors. The truth I was looking for lived elsewhere. It lived in the crowded, noisy neighborhoods where people worked and slept, where they argued and laughed without fear of being overheard by a passing magistrate. It was a place scholars like me rarely ventured. I ran my thumb over the smooth wax, erasing the useless praise I had collected. A part of me, the part that valued order and formal inquiry, recoiled from the thought of plunging into the city's chaotic residential districts. Yet, the historian in me, the part that truly drove my purpose, knew there was no other way. My methods had been tested against the official heart of the city and found wanting. To capture the real life of Rome, I had to leave the grand stage and venture into the narrow, winding streets where the great performance of the Forum gave way to the unscripted reality of daily existence. My first day had taught me a difficult but essential lesson. The challenge of documenting this era was far more complex than I had ever imagined, testing my approach to history in ways I was only beginning to understand. The grand marble of the Forum felt a world away, though it was only a short walk. I left its echoing pronouncements behind, venturing into the maze of streets that was the Subura. Here, the buildings were not temples to the gods, but towering apartment blocks, known as insulae, leaning against one another for support. Their brick and timber sides were stained with soot and time, creating narrow canyons where the sky was only a sliver of blue. It was here, I hoped, that the true story of Rome could be found, not in polished speeches, but in the rhythm of daily life. The shift from open plaza to tight alleyway was immediate. My movements felt smaller, more contained by the press of humanity all around me. A harsh mix of sounds replaced the forum's measured echoes. A blacksmith's hammer rang against an anvil just feet from my ear, while from an open window above, two women carried on a shouting match that seemed to be their normal way of talking. Children, their tunics dusty, chased a stray dog with shrieks of delight, their laughter a bright thread in the heavy weave of noise. This was not a place for quiet questions with a stylus and tablet. Instead, my work here required a different skill, the art of becoming invisible, of listening to the city's true heartbeat. I found a spot near a public fountain and simply watched, letting the currents of life flow around me. As I stood there, I noticed a musty smell of damp brick seemed to have worked its way into the fibers of my tunic, a permanent scent of the neighborhood. A long queue of people waited at the fountain, their clay and leather buckets at their feet. It was a slow-moving line, and conversations started and stopped with the casual ease of neighbors. I focused on a man near the front, his arms dusted with flour and his face lined with weariness. He was a baker, complaining to the woman behind him about the grain dole, the monthly handout of food from the state that kept so many fed. He wasn't speaking of grand policy, but of how the uncertain price affected the cost of every loaf he baked. 1 month, the price is fair, he grumbled, wiping sweat from his brow with a floured hand. The next, who knows? Caesar brings shiploads of grain from Egypt, they say, but it helps the merchants more than it helps my family eat. His words were plain and honest, the kind of truth I had failed to find among the forum statues. This was it, the real material of my study. I felt a surge of excitement, a scholar's joy at finding a genuine source. His candor was a refreshing drink after the dry, official pronouncements I had recorded before. I was about to inch closer, perhaps to ask a follow-up question, when a shadow fell over us. The baker's complaint died on his lips. A man had appeared at the edge of the small crowd, a minor magistrate by the cut of his clean toga and the authoritative way he stood. He wasn't a powerful man, but he carried the weight of the city's vast administration with him. His eyes scanned the line, passing over the faces until they settled on me. He noted my scholar's satchel, the glint of the stylus tucked into its loop, and his expression hardened almost imperceptibly. The baker suddenly found his bucket fascinating, and the woman behind him turned away to adjust her shawl. The moment of open conversation was over, sealed shut by this man's silent presence. After a moment that stretched uncomfortably long, the official gestured for me to step aside, away from the fountain. My heart began to beat a little faster. He led me a few paces down the narrow street, his voice low when he finally spoke, yet every word landed with the weight of a stone. "You are a man of letters, I see," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. "A noble pursuit. But remember that a scholar's curiosity can curdle as easily as milk left in the sun. He did not threaten me. He did not raise his voice. He simply offered his observation, a piece of friendly advice that felt colder than any command. He gave a slight nod, then turned and walked away without another word, melting back into the flow of the street. I stood there for a long time, the sounds of the Subura returning to my ears, but they seemed different now, tinged with a new layer of meaning. The official hadn't accused me of anything, yet his message was perfectly clear. My inquiries, however academic, were being noticed. I was no longer just an observer. I was an object of observation myself. The simple act of listening now carried a risk I had not properly understood before I left the forum. My initial academic zeal, that bright flame of purpose, now felt a flicker of caution. It wasn't fear, not yet, but a new and unwelcome awareness. I had learned more in 1 hour in the Subura than in a full day among the senators and merchants. But that knowledge came at a price. Questioning people directly had failed, and now simple passive listening had drawn unwanted attention. The baker's honest complaint was precisely the kind of truth my patron wanted me to document for his history. Yet the system that produced that truth was already warning me to look away. I clutched the satchel at my side, the wax tablets inside suddenly feeling heavier. They held only the polished, empty phrases from the forum, but my mind was now filled with the baker's tired voice and the official's chillingly calm advice. To continue my work, to find the real stories of life under Caesar, I would have to be much more careful. The public square was a stage, and the crowded neighborhood was watched. I needed a different sort of place, somewhere less obvious, where the walls did not have official ears. I began to walk, my steps taking me away from the fountain and deeper into the winding streets. Each breath felt a little more conscious, each glance over my shoulder a little more deliberate. The rough, splintery texture of a wooden handrail I grabbed to steady myself on a steep set of stairs was a sharp reminder of the unvarnished world I had entered. Even the water I eventually drank from another fountain tasted gritty, a contrast to the clean water of my patron's villa. Everything here was raw and unfiltered, including the danger. My observational skills were sharpening. It was true. I had learned that listening was far more powerful than asking. But I had also learned that powerful people do not like to be listened to so closely. I had sought the city's pulse and found it, but I had also placed my finger on a sensitive nerve. To get the truth, I realized, I would need to find a place where people felt safe enough to speak it. A place where a minor magistrate would not think to look for a quiet scholar and his notes. That official's quiet advice about the nature of curiosity lingered in my thoughts, a sour note in the bustling music of the Subura. It followed me through the alleys and clung to me more persistently than the smell of charcoal smoke. My mission had just become far more complicated than I could have ever imagined. The magistrate's veiled warning in the Subura had left a chill in my bones that had nothing to do with the evening breeze. His words about curiosity curdling like milk were not a piece of friendly advice. They were a boundary line drawn in the dust, a clear signal that my direct methods had attracted notice. I understood then that my project could not continue as it had. To simply walk up to people and ask about their lives under Caesar was like asking a mouse its opinion of the cat while the cat is in the room. This realization meant that my quest for the truth required a new, less obvious approach. If people would not speak to me directly, I would have to go where they spoke freely to each other, a place where authority was a distant concern and honesty was loosened by comfort and cheap drink. Following this line of thought, I found myself drawn away from the main thoroughfares and into the twisting side streets of a working-class district. Here, the buildings leaned against each other for support, their upper floors jutting out over the narrow lanes. The sounds of workshops had faded, replaced by the lower, more intimate noises of evening life. From an open doorway spilled a pool of wavering yellow light and a low rumble of conversation. A simple wooden sign depicting a rather cheerful-looking boar hung above the entrance. It was a tavern, one of many in Rome, but it felt far removed from the political heart of the city. This, I decided, was the perfect place to become invisible. A simple scholar reviewing his notes in a corner, noticed by none. Pushing through the heavy leather flap that served as a door, I was met with a wave of smells so strong it almost made me recoil. The sharp, vinegary scent of the house wine, so different from the finer vintages in my patron's home, mingled with the earthy odor of sweat and damp wool from the patrons. I paused for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the gloom. The space was lit by only a few sputtering oil lamps, their flames casting long, dancing shadows that made it difficult to clearly see the faces of the men within. This was good. Anonymity was what I sought. I made my way to the counter, where a burly man with arms as thick as small logs nodded at me, and I held up a single finger. In exchange for a couple of small bronze coins, he filled a clay cup with a dark, reddish liquid and pushed it toward me. With my sour wine in hand, I found an unoccupied bench in the darkest corner of the room. The wooden table before me was rough-hewn and coated with a sticky residue from countless spilled drinks. I carefully placed my satchel on the bench beside me and took out a wax tablet and stylus, arranging them as if preparing for a long session of study. In reality, my ears were my primary tool now, not my eyes or my pen. I took a small sip of the wine. It was as bitter as I had expected, a taste that seemed to match the weary mood of the room. The low murmur I had heard from the street was, from inside, a complex blend of sounds. Dice rattling against a wooden board, a burst of rough laughter from one table, and the steady, discontented grumbling from another. It was this last sound that drew my attention. From this vantage point, I could observe a group of 4 legionaries who had claimed a large table near the center of the room. Their armor was unstrapped and piled on the floor beside them, their thick leather belts and short swords resting on the bench. They were off duty, their faces grimy with the dust of the training fields. These were not the pristine soldiers of a victory parade. These were working men, their bodies hardened by discipline, and their spirits soured by something I could not yet name. They drank deeply from their own cups, their movements slow and heavy. One of them, a man whose face was already lined with more years than my own, slammed his cup down with a dull thud that made the others look up. "More promises," the older soldier growled, his voice a low rasp that carried easily in the relative quiet of our corner. "Always more promises. Land in the colonies," he said, "a farm to call my own after Gaul, after Egypt, after Spain." He spat on the dirt floor, a gesture of profound disgust. "I have given 20 years of my life, my blood, my friends. And what is my reward? This sour wine and another night in a rented room." The other men nodded in grim agreement, their faces shadowed and hard in the flickering lamplight. My hand, resting on my tablet, grew still. These were not the rehearsed praises I had heard in the forum. This was something raw and dangerous. Another soldier, younger but with a jagged scar that cut through one eyebrow, leaned forward. "It is the way of things," he said, though there was no acceptance in his tone. "Caesar wins his triumphs. The whole city celebrates, and men like Cornelius Balbus and his friends get richer buying up the land we were promised. They build their grand villas with the spoils of our wars, while we are told to be patient." He laughed, a short, bitter sound without any humor. "My patience is as thin as my tunic." The conversation was treasonous. To speak against Caesar's decrees, to question the distribution of wealth and land, these were not idle complaints. These were the seeds of mutiny, the kind of talk that could get a man flogged, or worse. My heart began to pound a frantic rhythm against my ribs. My duty as a historian, the very purpose of my commission from my patron, demanded that I record this. This was the truth I had been seeking, the unvarnished, painful reality of life for those who paid the highest price for Rome's glory. This was the story hidden beneath the marble and the monuments. Yet the magistrate's warning echoed in my mind. To write this down, even here in this dark tavern, was an act of immense risk. What if someone saw? What if one of these very soldiers, drunk and paranoid, noticed the scribe in the corner scratching away after their every word? The instinct for self-preservation screamed at me to put the stylus down, to drink my wine, and to forget what I had heard. I found myself completely torn. To ignore these words would be a betrayal of my entire purpose. My great work would become just another hollow tribute, filled with the same empty praises I could have copied from any public inscription. It would be a lie. But to record them in plain Latin was to invite disaster. My hand trembled slightly as I held the stylus. I thought of my quiet life of study, of my scholarly ambitions, of the comfortable future my patron's favor might provide. All of it could be undone by a single foolish act. Yet the image of the veteran's weary, resentful face was burned into my mind. His story, and the stories of men like him deserved to be remembered. It was the heart of the matter. In that moment of indecision, a solution surfaced from the depths of my academic training. During my studies in rhetoric, I had practiced various forms of shorthand, quick ways to capture the flow of a fast-paced speech. I had even, as a private amusement, developed my own system, a mix of Greek letters and private symbols that no one else could read. It was a scholar's game, nothing more. Until now. I made my choice. My duty to the truth was greater than my fear, but my fear would make me clever. I would not betray my mission, but I would not openly invite my own destruction either. My fingers, now steady, gripped the stylus with renewed purpose. I did not write down the soldier's words in the flowing Latin script I used for my official notes. Instead, I began to press a series of sharp, angular marks into the smooth, dark wax. A circle with a line through it for Caesar, a jagged shape for land, a simple triangle for soldier. Each symbol was a placeholder for a dangerous idea. It was slow work, and my focus was absolute. The sounds of the tavern faded into a dull background hum. The world shrank to the small illuminated rectangle of my wax tablet and the secret language taking shape upon its surface. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. As I worked, I felt a profound shift within myself. I was no longer a passive observer, a simple collector of facts. I was now an active participant in a hidden world. I was concealing information, creating a secret record that ran parallel to the official one I would present to my patron. This act of coding the truth was my first real step away from the naive scholar who had arrived in the forum with fresh tablets and an open heart. I was learning the city's other language, the one spoken not in grand speeches, but in bitter whispers. And I was creating my own secret script to capture it. When the soldiers finally pushed themselves up from their table and staggered out into the night, I remained in my corner, my work complete. I looked down at the tablet. To any other eyes, it would appear to be a meaningless series of doodles, perhaps the idle scratchings of a bored student. But I knew what it held. It held the weight of a man's 20 years of service. It held the bitterness of a broken promise. It held a truth so potent it had to be hidden in a language of shadows. I had captured something real, and in doing so, I had put myself in real danger. The coded words on the wax felt heavier than any stone, a secret I would now carry alone. The coded notes from the tavern felt like a lead weight in my satchel as I made my way to my patron's villa on the Palatine Hill. Leaving the noise and smells of the lower city behind, I ascended the slope where the homes grew larger and the streets cleaner. Servants washed the stone steps leading to his entrance, and the water running in the gutters was clear, not choked with refuse. My own rough-spun tunic felt coarse and out of place, as a doorkeeper, noticing my scribe's tools, led me through a sunlit courtyard and into the cool shade of his library. Here, there was a profound quiet, a stillness that seemed to press in on me after the constant clamor of the Sabura. The only sounds were the distant murmur of household activity and the soft slap of my own sandals on the polished floor. My patron greeted me with a warm smile. He was a man whose family had helped shape the Republic for generations, and he saw my work as a continuation of that legacy, a project to capture the spirit of Rome under Caesar's guidance for all time. His library was his sanctuary, a testament to order and knowledge. The clean, dry scent of papyrus scrolls and cedarwood chests filled the room, a fragrance of preservation and permanence. Countless scrolls were stacked in perfect, labeled columns within wooden cubbies, a stark and almost unnerving contrast to the messy, unpredictable truths I had been gathering in the city's tangled streets. He gestured for me to unroll my notes on a large, smooth table of dark, polished wood. Initially, he was delighted with my progress. I spoke of the forum, of the merchants, and then moved to my descriptions of the Subura. I described the taste of the gritty water from the public fountain, the savory smell of chickpeas roasting over a vendor's brazier, and the arguments of a baker over the grain dole. My patron nodded enthusiastically, seeing these details as colorful threads to be woven into the grand tapestry of our history. "Excellent, Lucius, excellent," he declared, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. "This is the lifeblood of the city. You give the official records a human face, a sense of real life being lived." He saw it all as charming texture, the harmless grumbling of common folk that made the official story of prosperity feel more authentic. This praise emboldened me, perhaps foolishly. I thought he, a man of deep intellect, would want to understand the full picture. I decided to test the waters, to hint at the deeper, more troubled currents I had sensed. Choosing my words with care, I mentioned the conversations I had overheard among the soldiers, not the treasonous words from the tavern, but a more general feeling. "There is a weariness among the veterans," I began, my voice lower now. "A sense that their sacrifices in the wars have not been fully repaid. They speak of promised land that has not come, and of friends lost for triumphs they do not share in." I looked to him, expecting a thoughtful frown, a scholarly question. Instead, his warmth vanished, as if a winter wind had blown through the room. The smile left his face, replaced by a tight, strained expression. He stood up and walked to the high window that overlooked his private garden, turning his back to me for a long moment. When he turned around, his eyes were hard. "Lucius," he said, and his voice was no longer that of a mentor, but of a man issuing a stern correction. "Such talk is the domain of gossips in taverns, not historians. It is unsubstantiated, emotional, and dangerous. It has no place in a serious work." He took a step closer, his presence suddenly feeling immense in the silent library. He placed a hand on a stack of official public records, tapping the tightly rolled papyrus. "We are documenting the pillars of our civilization under Caesar," he stated, his voice firm and absolute. "Focus on the new aqueducts that bring clean water to 100,000 souls. Write about the grain shipments that prevent famine, the temples being restored to honor the gods, the expansion of trade that brings wealth to our shores. These are the facts, the great and lasting truths of our time." He gestured dismissively, the heavy, finely woven fabric of his toga sweeping through the air. "Do not go searching for cracks in the foundation. It is not your place, and you will find only trouble there." His words struck me with the force of a physical blow. This was the man who had set me on my path, who had spoken so passionately about capturing the true voice of Rome. Now he was telling me to ignore any voice that did not sing praises. I felt a profound sense of disillusionment settle over me, cold and heavy. He was not a villain. He was a good man, a man who loved Rome. But I saw in that moment that his love was tied to an ideal, an image of the city he needed to be true. He was bound by his position, by his wealth, and most of all, by a deep and abiding fear of instability. The rest of our meeting was short. I nodded, gathered my notes, and gave him the empty promises he needed to hear. I would focus on public works, I assured him. I would detail the religious rites. He seemed relieved, the warmth returning to his eyes. But it was too late. A gulf had opened between us, a space of silence where the dangerous truths I was collecting now had to reside. He believed he was protecting me and the project, but what he was truly doing was building a wall around the very history he claimed to champion. Walking out of his villa and back down the hill, I felt more alone than ever. My patron, the one man I thought would understand my quest for the unvarnished truth, had just ordered me to put a cloth over my eyes. He had given me a map of Rome that showed only the grand temples and wide avenues, and he had forbidden me from exploring the narrow, twisting alleys where most Romans actually lived their lives. He was my source of guidance, and more importantly, my protection. I now understood I had neither.
This realization brought with it a cold clarity. I could no longer be honest with him. My work would now have to be two separate things. There would be the official history, the one he wanted, filled with impressive buildings and prosperous trade, the story of the pillars. And then there would be the other one, the true one, the one whispered in taverns and marketplaces, the one I kept hidden in a coded script. The rift between us was not just about a difference of opinion. It was a fundamental break. He had praised my descriptions of the Sabora as colorful detail, but he failed to see that the grit in the water and the worry over the price of grain were not mere decoration. They were the story itself. The weariness of the soldiers was not gossip. It was the true cost of the triumphs everyone celebrated in the Forum. I saw now that my patron, and men like him, wanted to admire the strength of the tree without ever looking at the dirt and struggle of the roots from which it grew. As I reached the bottom of the hill, the city's harsh mix of sounds rose to meet me once more. It no longer felt like chaos, but like a language I was just beginning to understand. My patron lived in a world of silent, orderly scrolls, but the real history of Rome was being written every day in the noise and sweat of the streets. My task as a chronicler had led me not to a shared understanding with my mentor, but to a silent, solitary duty to the truth he wished to ignore. The conversation with my patron left a sour taste in my mouth, one that no amount of watered wine could wash away. His library, once a sanctuary of shared purpose, now felt like a cage lined with scrolls I was forbidden to write. His words echoed in my head. Focus on the pillars of the Republic, not the cracks in the foundation. But what is a house without its foundation? And what is a history that ignores the truth for fear of causing a tremor? I felt utterly alone, adrift between the polished falsehoods of the elite and the dangerous truths of the common man. To clear my head, I walked, letting the city's currents pull me away from the manicured gardens of the Palatine Hill and down toward the roaring life of the river.
I found myself on a street that ran parallel to the Tiber, in a market that served the docks. Here, the air was not filled with the scent of jasmine or cedar, but with the powerful, salty smell of the sea, and the sharp odor of fish being gutted on wooden blocks. The cobblestones under my sandals were slick and uneven, kept permanently damp by the river's proximity and the constant sloshing from buckets and barrels. Men with sun-weathered skin and arms as thick as mooring ropes shouted prices for oysters from Baiae and tuna from Sicily. It was a place of raw commerce, far from the Senate's shadow. I clutched my satchel, containing my notes and tablets, and simply observed, letting the harsh mix of sounds wash over me, a welcome distraction from my patron's chilling advice. Navigating the crowd required constant attention. People shoved past without apology, their focus entirely on the transaction at hand. I was adjusting my path to avoid a cart laden with dripping amphora of fish sauce, when a heavy-set man, moving far too quickly for his size, slammed directly into my shoulder. The impact was jarring, knocking the breath from my lungs. My leather satchel flew from my grasp, its contents spilling across the damp stones with a terrible clatter. My stylus, a few loose wax tablets, and a small unbound bundle of papyrus notes skittered in every direction. For a moment, I could only stare at the mess, my work scattered amidst fish scales and mud. The man who had struck me was instantly full of apologies. "My deepest regrets, citizen," he boomed, his broad face a mask of concern. "Clumsy as an ox I am. Here, let me help you." Before I could protest, he was on his knees, gathering my things with surprising speed. He scooped up the stylus and the larger tablets, wiping them on his tunic before handing them back. He even found the little bundle of notes, which had slid near a drain. He pressed them into my hand, offered another round of profuse apologies, and then disappeared back into the moving wall of people as quickly as he had appeared. I stood there, flustered and a bit bruised, stuffing everything back into my satchel and feeling grateful that nothing seemed broken. It was only when I sought refuge in a quieter side street, leaning against a cool stone wall to catch my breath, that a prickle of unease disturbed my relief. Something about the man's helpfulness felt practiced, too smooth for a genuine accident. My fingers went through the contents of my satchel, checking each item. The main tablets were there, filled with my safe observations for my patron. The stylus was there, but the small bundle of unbound notes. I pulled it out again. It felt lighter. I quickly unrolled the papyrus. The outer sheets, detailing market prices, were present. But the inner pages,
The ones where I had secretly transcribed the bitter complaints of the legionary in the tavern, were gone. A cold dread, sharp and sudden, washed over me, far more chilling than the damp river air. My first thought was to find the city watch, the vigile who patrolled the markets. But that thought died as soon as it formed. What would I tell them? That a common thief had stolen notes containing treasonous talk against Caesar? I would be inviting the very scrutiny I had been so desperate to avoid. The watchman would ask questions, and those questions would lead back to my work, my patron, and the dangerous path I was walking. A part of me, a new, harder part that had been forming since my visit to the Subura, knew this was no ordinary street theft. The old Lucius, the scholar, would have reported the crime. This new Lucius understood he was not the victim of a crime, but the subject of a message. Instead of crying for help, I made a choice. I would not be prey. I tightened the strap of my satchel, my knuckles white, and scanned the crowded street where the man had vanished. I had only seen him for a moment, but his bulk and his hurried gait were distinctive. My fear was a frantic bird beating against my ribs, but alongside it grew a stubborn, cold anger. My work was not just ink on papyrus. It was the lives of the baker, the soldier, the weaver. It was their truth, and I would not let it be stolen and silenced without knowing by whom. I took a deep breath that did little to calm me, and pushed myself back into the throng, my eyes searching.
There, near a stall selling cheap pottery, I saw him. He was no longer hurrying. He moved with a deliberate, casual pace, weaving through the shoppers like a man with no particular destination. He was just another face in the crowd, and that was what made my pursuit so difficult. I had to stay far enough back to remain unseen, yet close enough not to lose him in the shifting sea of bodies. We moved away from the river, leaving the smell of fish behind for the scent of baking bread and charcoal fires from countless small workshops. Each step I took was a conscious decision, a step away from the safety of my old life and deeper into a world of shadows and unseen rules. He led me through a winding maze of streets I barely knew, each narrower and quieter than the last. The sounds of the main market faded, replaced by the clang of a single blacksmith's hammer and the distant laughter of children. Finally, he ducked into a small, sunless alley between two towering apartment blocks. I hesitated at the entrance, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The alley was a dead end, cluttered with discarded crates and pottery shards. It was the perfect place for a quiet transaction. Flattening myself against the rough brick wall, I peered around the corner, my breath held tight in my chest. The heavy-set man was not alone. Standing with him was another figure, a man of average height and build, dressed in a plain, unadorned tunic of good quality cloth. He was the picture of a minor government functionary, the kind of man who is invisible in his role, yet holds a quiet authority. The stern, impassive look on his face told me he was not here for idle chat. There were no greetings exchanged. My thief simply passed the stolen pages of my notes to the stern-faced man. The official took them, glanced at them briefly,
then folded them and tucked them inside his tunic. The entire exchange was over in seconds, conducted in absolute, chilling silence.
As the official turned to leave, the thief said something too low for me to hear. The official paused, his gaze sweeping the entrance of the alley. For a terrifying second, I thought he saw me. I shrank back, pressing myself so hard against the brick that its rough texture bit into my shoulder. I squeezed my eyes shut, expecting the sound of footsteps, the grip of a hand on my tunic. But there was nothing. When I dared to look again, both men were gone. The alley was empty, save for the rubbish and the shadows. I leaned against the wall, my legs suddenly weak. The careful distance I had tried to keep between myself and the powers of Rome had vanished. They were not just watching, they were reading my most secret thoughts, plucking the truth right out of my hands. My naivety was gone, stripped away and discarded in that filthy alley. I was no longer a researcher chronicling the life of the city. I was a target, my every move noted, my every word weighed by unseen figures in plain tunics. The fear I felt was no longer a vague apprehension. It was a constant, living presence, a shadow that would now walk with me everywhere. I made my way back to my small room, though the familiar streets now seemed foreign and menacing. Every passerby seemed to be watching. Every quiet conversation seemed to be about me. The simple act of walking home became an exercise in controlled terror. The work I had undertaken with such scholarly zeal had turned into something else entirely. It was a fight, and I had just been shown how easily my opponent could disarm me. The knowledge of their reach, of their silent, efficient methods, was a weight far heavier than any bundle of scrolls. The truth I sought was precious, but the price of finding it, I now understood, might be everything I had. The theft of my notes left a hollowness in my chest, a constant, chilling reminder that I was no longer an invisible observer. My simple inquiries had been noticed by men who moved in shadows, men who did not make idle threats. For several days I did nothing, my scholarly work gathering dust in a corner. Each time I walked the streets, I felt unseen eyes upon my back, and the casual conversations of the city now seemed filled with hidden meanings. To continue my old methods of direct questioning or even quiet observation in crowded places was to invite disaster. My fear was a cold knot in my stomach, but beneath it, a stubborn anger began to burn. They wanted to frighten me into silence, to make me another purveyor of the official, polished story of Rome. I would not allow it. This new resolve forced me to abandon my broad approach. Instead of seeking 100 shallow streams of information, I needed to find a few deep wells. I needed people whose stories were too vital to be ignored, yet who were themselves overlooked by the men in power. My mind turned to the soldiers, the foundation upon which Caesar's reputation was built. Their voices were either celebrated in grand triumphs or silenced by discipline. Where could one hear the truth? The answer was the Campus Martius, the great field of Mars outside the city's formal boundary. It was a wide, open plain used for military drills and public gatherings, a place where soldiers were simply men for a few hours, away from the rigid structure of their barracks.
So I made my way there, but not as a scholar with an inquisitive gaze. I went as a craftsman with a service to offer. I found a spot near a shaded portico where veterans and off-duty legionaries gathered to talk and gamble with dice. I set down a small folding stool, laid out a fresh wax tablet, a sharp stylus, and a pot of ink with a few strips of papyrus, a more permanent writing material for important letters. I did not ask questions. I simply put up a small wooden sign. Letters written. A cup of wine is fair payment. It was a simple transaction, offering my skill for a moment of their time. My professional ability, the very thing that had put me in danger, would now become my shield. For the first few hours, my customers were young recruits, flushed with pride and homesickness. They asked for simple letters, full of bravado for their fathers and sweet nothings for girls they left behind in their villages. I wrote their words faithfully, capturing their youthful certainty. In return, they shared their cheap wine and talked of the glory they hoped to find. I listened, nodded, and learned. I learned which legions were recruiting, what the daily rations were like, and the common gossip that circulated among the ranks. This information was useful, but it was still the surface of things. I was offering a service, and through that service, I was slowly building a different kind of reputation, not as an inquisitive historian, but as a trustworthy scribe. This quiet work eventually brought a different kind of man to my stool. He was older, his face a landscape of old battles, with a pale scar that cut from his left eyebrow down to his jaw. He moved with a stiff gait that spoke of old injuries, but his eyes were clear and steady. The insignia on his belt marked him as a former centurion, an officer who had commanded a century of 80 men. He did not ask for a letter filled with boasts. He wanted me to write to an artisan in the city, confirming the apprenticeship of his young son. It was a father's simple, hopeful duty. As I carefully scratched the formal phrases into the wax, he sat beside me on the hard-packed earth, the coarse, scratchy wool of his tunic brushing against my arm. As I worked, he began to speak, his voice a low rumble that did not carry far. He spoke not of Caesar's glorious victories, but of the biting cold in Gaul, a chill that he said settled deep in your bones and never truly left. He described the taste of stale bread, so hard you had to soak it in water to chew it, and the constant, gnawing hunger that was a soldier's companion on long marches. He did not mention grand strategy or the brilliance of his commander. Instead, he spoke of the friends he had lost, saying their names softly as if they were standing right there with us. A peacock from a nearby nobleman's garden let out a series of mournful cries, and for a moment the centurion fell silent, lost in a memory I could not see. His loyalty to Caesar, I realized, was absolute, but it was not the shining devotion praised in the forum. It was a weary, costly loyalty, paid for with his health, his youth, and the lives of men he had led. He believed Caesar had given Rome purpose, but he was achingly aware of the price. He spoke of the land promised to veterans, land that was always just over the next hill, beyond the next campaign. I listened. My stylus paused over the tablet. The letter about his son's future seemed so small compared to the immense weight of his past. I finished the letter and we shared a cup of wine, its taste made bitter by the wild herbs mixed in by the vendor to stretch his supply. In that conversation, I understood I had found the path forward. I could gain trust and gather the unvarnished truth, not through direct inquiry, but through humble service. My skill with a stylus, once a tool for simple documentation, had become a key, unlocking personal histories that no official record would ever contain. I felt a profound sense of connection to this man, a deep empathy for the true human cost of Rome's relentless expansion. These were not cracks in the foundation my patron had warned me about. They were the very stones of the foundation itself, shaped by pressure and loss. I collected more stories like his in the following weeks. Each letter I wrote for a soldier became a quiet exchange. I gave them a voice to reach their families, and they, in turn, gave me small pieces of their lives. One man spoke of the strange beauty of the Egyptian sky at night. Another described the fear he felt seeing a charging line of German warriors for the first time. These were not the grand, sweeping histories my patron desired. They were intimate, personal, and profoundly true. I was collecting powerful, nuanced accounts that stood in stark contrast to the simple narrative of glorious conquest promoted by Caesar's supporters.
The problem, of course, was what to do with them. These stories were far more dangerous than the baker's complaints about the grain dole. To write them down, even in my code, felt like holding a burning coal. I had no safe way to share them or even to store them. Each evening, I returned to my room and committed the most potent details to memory, a silent recitation of names, places, and feelings. My mind became my only secret archive, a library of ghosts and echoes that I could not risk putting on a scroll. This new work, however, did not go unnoticed. While I was no longer a suspicious scholar asking questions, I had become something else, the scribe who listens. My reputation as a trustworthy man who could be counted on for discretion began to spread through the barracks and veteran communities. This quiet fame was a double-edged sword. It brought me the stories I so desperately sought, but I knew it was only a matter of time before this new reputation reached the ears of more powerful people. I was no longer being watched as a potential threat, perhaps, but I was now being noticed as a potential asset. This subtle shift created a new kind of tension within me. I was succeeding in my mission beyond what I had imagined, uncovering the very heart of the city's experience. Yet, with every story I heard, the weight of my secret task grew heavier. I wondered often if any history could ever be truly written without the historian becoming part of the currents they sought to describe. This new way of working had profoundly changed how I saw the men who built this empire. My work among the soldiers on the Campus Martius did not go unnoticed. For a time, my days fell into a predictable rhythm of writing letters, listening to stories, and carefully transcribing the nuanced truths I heard into my coded script. Then, one afternoon, a man approached me as I packed away my styluses. He was not a legionary. His tunic was of a finer weave than any I owned, and his demeanor was that of a man accustomed to giving orders, not taking them. He handed me a thin tablet of wood, its wax surface a pristine, intimidating white. The message was brief, impressed in elegant letters. A summons to a villa on the Palatine Hill, the most exclusive of Rome's 7 hills, where the city's powerful made their homes. I felt a cold knot form in my gut. This was not the kind of attention a humble scholar ever seeks.
The next day, I made the journey. Leaving the chaotic energy of the lower city behind, the climb up the Palatine Hill was like entering another world. The streets were wide and swept clean, and the noise of craftsmen and vendors faded away, replaced by a quiet dignity. I saw no towering apartment blocks here, only the high walls of sprawling private homes, their entrances guarded by stern-faced servants. My own footsteps, usually lost in the city's harsh mix of sounds, now seemed loud against the paving stones. Each step upward felt heavier, as if I were not just climbing a hill, but ascending into a layer of society where the rules were different, and the consequences for a misstep were far more severe. My simple leather sandals, so practical in the mud of the Subura, felt flimsy and inadequate here. A servant with a blank, expressionless face met me at a towering bronze gate and led me inside without a word. We passed through a breathtaking central courtyard open to the sky, where the delicate scent of blooming jasmine hung in the still air. A small fountain trickled musically in the center, its water catching the light. The servants' sandals made no sound on the intricate mosaic floors, while my own made a soft scraping noise that felt like an intrusion. He showed me into a large, quiet room and left me there alone. It was a space designed to impress and to intimidate. Lifelike statues of Greek philosophers and athletes stood in alcoves, their marble eyes seeming to judge my presence. The walls were hung with portraits of stern-faced men in the robes of Republican consuls from generations past, a clear statement of the owner's lineage and beliefs. As I waited, my eyes fell upon my own reflection in the surface of a polished bronze shield hanging on the wall, an antique from some long-forgotten war. I saw a man in a plain, homespun tunic, his face etched with weariness from the city streets. I looked utterly out of place amidst such calculated grandeur. The silence in the room was immense, a heavy blanket that muffled the outside world. It was the silence of power, a quiet so profound that I could hear the faint thumping of my own heart against my ribs. It was a stark contrast to the constant noise of the city I had grown accustomed to, where silence often meant something was wrong. Here, it simply meant that nothing happened without permission.
The senator entered so quietly, I almost did not notice him. He was older, with a calm, composed face that revealed nothing. He moved with a practiced grace, his fine woolen toga settling perfectly around him as he took a seat on a carved wooden chair. He gestured for me to sit opposite him, a simple act that established his authority. He began to speak not with questions or demands, but with praise, his voice smooth and even. He spoke of my dedication to documenting the true voice of Rome, and complimented my diligence in speaking with the common folk.
Every word was perfectly chosen, elegant and circling, avoiding any direct point. It felt less like a conversation and more like a performance I was meant to admire. I gave polite, short answers, my mind racing to understand his purpose. He praised my work for several long minutes, but finally arriving at his proposition. He told me he admired my search for truth in an age of flattery and official proclamations. Because of this, he was prepared to offer me his protection. More than that, he would grant me access to his private library, filled with family records and histories that were not available to the public. For a historian, this was like offering water to a man dying of thirst. The thought of seeing such documents, of being able to cross-reference the stories from the street with the records of the elite, was a temptation almost too powerful to resist. My work could become something truly substantial, something that might even last. Then came the price for this incredible gift. In return for his patronage, he wanted me to continue my work among the people and the soldiers, but to bring my findings to him. He wanted me to be his eyes and ears, to report on the mood of the city, the grumblings of the veterans, the whispers of discontent. He never used the word spy, but it hung in the silent air between us, as solid and as cold as the marble statues watching from the walls. The offer was a trap, beautifully baited. He was a man known for his traditionalist views, a quiet opponent of Caesar's ever-growing power. To accept his offer would be to take a side in the most dangerous political game in Rome.
I found myself completely torn. One part of me, the scholar, clamored to accept. The knowledge he offered was a treasure beyond price. It could be the breakthrough my work needed, a way to add depth and authority to the voices I had collected. Yet another part of me, the part that had learned caution in the Subura and fear in the tavern, recoiled from the idea. I would no longer be an independent observer. I would be a pawn, a piece moved by a powerful man in his contest with another. My loyalty would be to him, not to the truth. My work would be tainted, serving his political ends rather than the simple goal of understanding the lives of ordinary people. The weight of the decision pressed down on me. Drawing on every bit of formal training I had in rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking, I chose a careful middle path. I inclined my head respectfully, thanking the senator for his immense generosity and his faith in my humble project. I told him that his offer of access to his library would be invaluable to a true and balanced history. Then, addressing his request, I said I would be honored to provide him with my general observations on the city's prevailing mood, as this was a natural part of any comprehensive social study. I deliberately used the language of a scholar, not a spy, framing my cooperation in academic terms that gave me room to maneuver. I would give him summaries, not secrets. I would offer him the scent of the soup, but not the recipe. The senator listened to my careful reply, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he simply studied my face. Then a slow, knowing smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was not a warm smile, but one of appreciation, as if he recognized the skill in my response. He understood that I had not refused him, but I had not fully surrendered either.
He had tested me, and in his eyes, I had perhaps passed. He gave a slight nod. "Excellent," he said simply. "My librarian will expect you. You may begin tomorrow." The interview was over. He had gotten what he wanted, a connection to the city's pulse, and I had what I wanted, access and a sliver of independence. But the unspoken agreement felt as binding as any signed contract. I was dismissed with a slight wave of his hand. The silent servant reappeared as if from nowhere and escorted me back through the quiet halls and the fragrant courtyard. The cool, smooth feel of the marble floor beneath my sandals felt different on the way out, harder and more unforgiving. The perfect silence of the villa no longer felt peaceful. It felt watchful, a space where every whisper was heard and noted. The scent of jasmine now seemed cloying, too sweet. I had walked into this villa a simple scholar, worried about being followed in the streets. I was walking out a player, however minor, in a deadly game I had only ever intended to observe from a safe distance. The bronze gates closed behind me with a soft, final sound. As I began my descent from the Palatine Hill, the familiar sounds and smells of the lower city rose up to meet me. Before, they were simply the backdrop of my life and work. Now, they seemed like a different world, one I was no longer fully a part of. The senator's offer had built a bridge between the world of power and my own, but it was a bridge I would have to cross with extreme care. The risks of my work had just grown enormously, becoming more complex and far more personal. I carried the heavy knowledge of this new fragile alliance with me as I disappeared back into the anonymous crowds of Rome. My work with soldiers led to a summons from a powerful anti-Caesar senator who offered me protection and access to private archives in exchange for information on the city's mood, forcing me to cautiously accept and become entangled in elite politics. I have now entered into a dangerous, unspoken agreement with a powerful senator, gaining valuable access for my research, but also becoming a pawn in a high-stakes political conflict.
The agreement with the senator left a bitter taste in my mouth, like biting into an unripe olive. While his patronage offered a shield, it also felt like a chain, pulling me into a political swamp I had only ever intended to observe from the shore. The weight of my double life, the simple chronicler for my original patron and the secret observer for the senator, was becoming a physical burden. Each day, my satchel, filled with its carefully separated notes, felt heavier. The coded tablets containing the soldiers' treasonous words seemed to burn with a cold fire against my side. This growing unease gnawed at me, creating a desperate need for a familiar voice, for a connection to the straightforward world of scholarship I had left behind. Because of this, I found myself walking toward the quarter of the city where the workshops of the scribes were clustered together. I sought out a colleague from my earliest training days, a man whose ambitions never extended beyond the clean, predictable lines of a legal contract.
His world was one of fixed fees and clear consequences, a stark contrast to the murky waters I now navigated. I found him in a public scriptorium, a long, narrow room where 24 men bent over low desks. The air was dry, and the scent of old ink and papyrus was a comforting reminder of a simpler time. A constant soft scratching sound filled the space, the combined noise of countless reed pens moving across parchment, a sound like autumn leaves skittering across a courtyard. I took a seat on a stool beside him, the wood worn smooth by years of use, and warmed my hands on a clay ink pot that sat near a small oil lamp. For a moment, watching him work, I felt a pang of envy for the safety of his repetitive task.
We spoke, for a time, of simple things: the health of our families, the rising cost of bread, the quality of the new ink from Egypt. But the pressure inside me was too great to be contained by such pleasantries. Keeping my voice low, just above the murmur of dictation from the far end of the room, I began to speak vaguely of my commission. I mentioned the difficulty of my work, the need for discretion, and the powerful men whose opinions I was meant to record. I expected a word of caution, perhaps some friendly advice on how to navigate such a task. Instead, his reaction was immediate and frightening. His work stopped, the scratching of his pen ceasing so abruptly that it seemed to create a pocket of silence around us. He turned to me, his face pale in the flickering lamplight. "Stop, Lucius," he whispered, his voice tight with a fear I did not understand. He reached out and grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my tunic with surprising strength. The warmth from the ink pot vanished, replaced by a sudden chill. "You must stop this work," he insisted, his eyes wide and darting toward the doorway, as if expecting someone to appear. He leaned closer, the scent of his fearful sweat suddenly sharp. His terror was so genuine, so raw, that it silenced the questions forming on my lips. It was clear this was not simple professional concern. This was a warning born from a deep and personal dread. "You are not the first bright young man to be given such a task," he continued, his grip tightening. He told me of another historian, a promising student from our own academy, who had been commissioned to investigate the grain supply routes a few years prior. The young man had been diligent, just as I was. He had asked questions, followed shipments, and noted discrepancies between the official records and the grain that actually arrived at the city's warehouses. He thought he was serving the public good, uncovering simple corruption. One day, he was simply gone from his usual haunts in the library. A week later, word came that he had received a sudden and unexpected promotion to a minor administrative post in the farthest reaches of Numidia, a miserable, fever-ridden province in North Africa.
My friend finally let go of my arm, leaving faint marks on my skin. He picked up his reed pen, but did not dip it in the ink. His hand trembled slightly as he stared at the half-finished contract on his desk. His career was over, my friend said, his voice barely audible over the scratching that had resumed around us. His name was struck from the Academy's register. His work was confiscated, and his family was told he had volunteered for the distant post. His voice was silenced completely, not with a blade, but with a piece of parchment and a boat ticket. He looked up at me then, his eyes holding a terrible, bleak knowledge. He let the final words fall with a dreadful finality. "They don't kill you, Lucius," he whispered, the truth of it landing like a stone in my gut. "They erase you." That single chilling idea of being erased followed me out of the scriptorium and into the bustling streets. The city, which moments before had felt vibrant and full of stories, now seemed like a vast machine designed for forgetting. Every official proclamation carved in stone, every statue of a triumphant general, suddenly appeared not as a monument to memory, but as a tool for enforcing a single approved version of it. The laughter of children playing in an alley, the argument between a merchant and his customer, the song of a bird from a rooftop garden, all of it felt fragile, temporary, easily silenced and forgotten. My friend's warning had fundamentally changed the nature of the threat I faced. I had prepared myself for the possibility of a dagger in a dark alley, a risk that carried a certain grim, romantic notion of dying for the truth. This, however, was a far more terrifying prospect: to be sent away, to have my work and my name removed from the record, to live out my days in some forgotten corner of the world while the official history rolled on without me. It was a death of a different kind. It was the death of purpose, the annihilation of everything a historian values. The senator's protection now seemed like a spider's web, and my patron's willful ignorance felt like a betrayal. Even the trust I had built with the soldiers on the Campus Martius felt like a danger, a connection that could be used to identify and discredit me. Every path I had taken, every person I had spoken to, now seemed to lead toward this silent, professional grave.
My sense of isolation was now absolute. There was no one I could turn to. My patron, who had set me on this path, would only caution me towards safer subjects. The senator, my new protector, was a man who would surely sacrifice me to his own political ambitions without a second thought. And my friends, the very people I might have sought for comfort, were clearly too frightened to even listen. Any step I took from this moment forward, I would have to take entirely on my own, shadowed by the knowledge that the greatest danger was not in being found out, but in being forgotten. My quest to write the history of Rome had become a perilous effort to avoid being erased by it. The cautious agreement I had struck with the senator left a bitter taste in my mouth, one that lingered long after I left his marble villa. I was now a player in a game whose rules I barely understood, caught between my duty to the truth and the dangerous currents of power. This new reality followed me through the streets and back toward my own modest part of the city. The journey to my rented room, usually a time for quiet reflection on the day's notes, felt different this evening. Every shadow seemed to stretch a little too far, and the usual clamor of the neighborhood felt muted, as if the entire city were holding its breath, waiting for me. My footsteps echoed on the worn paving stones, a solitary rhythm in the growing dusk. This feeling of unease solidified into something sharp and cold when I reached my own doorway. I pushed my iron key into the simple lock, but instead of the familiar smooth turn, it met resistance. A jarring, metallic scrape grated against my ears, a sound utterly wrong. I had to force the key, and the bolt slid back with a protesting groan. My hand paused on the wooden door. Locks in this part of Rome were not complex things. A determined thief would simply break the door. This subtle damage spoke of something else, something more precise and less hurried. My breath caught in my throat as I pushed the door open into the waiting silence.
Inside, an unsettling stillness had taken root. The small room, my sanctuary of thought and work, felt foreign. At first glance, nothing was truly amiss, but my mind, trained to notice the smallest details, began to register the wrongness of it all. A papyrus scroll I had left perfectly aligned with the edge of my small table was now nudged an inch to the left. The stylus I always placed beside my inkpot lay at an odd angle, as if dropped in haste. These were not the signs of a common burglar looking for a few coins. This was the work of someone searching with quiet, methodical care. Someone who wanted me to know they had been here. This profound sense of violation drove my eyes to the one place that mattered most: the small wooden chest tucked beneath my sleeping couch. I rushed to it, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The chest held all my work, the safe and the secret. To protect it, I always secured it with a simple clay seal, pressed firm with my family's signet ring while the clay was still wet. It was a simple measure, but it was mine. Now, scattered on the floorboards were the brittle, gray fragments of that seal. It was shattered, my family's mark broken into meaningless pieces. The sight was a physical blow. With trembling hands, I lifted the heavy wooden lid. Inside, my scrolls lay in what appeared to be perfect order. The neatly tied bundles documenting public works and market prices were all there. The safe histories, the ones for my patron, were untouched. A cold dread washed over me as I dug deeper. My fingers found the small, unbound bundle of wax tablets I kept wrapped in a linen cloth at the very bottom. This was where I kept the truth. This was where I had used my coded shorthand to record the legionaries' bitter complaints in the tavern, the baker's fears about the grain dole, the whispers that contradicted Caesar's grand vision of Rome. The cloth was there, but when I unwrapped it, the tablets were gone. The linen felt limp and empty in my hands. They had left everything else, taking only the most dangerous words, the ones that could condemn not only me, but the men who had spoken them. The message was as clear as a sentence carved in stone. We know what you are doing, and now we have the proof. A wave of pure terror, cold and absolute, washed over me. My first instinct, primal and overwhelming, was to run. I could pack a small satchel, leave the rest, and disappear into the countryside. I could make for a port city, take a ship to Greece or Egypt, and forget I ever tried to capture the soul of Rome on wax and papyrus. My life, my physical safety, screamed at me to flee. The warning from my friend in the scriptorium echoed in my mind. They don't kill you, they erase you. Perhaps they had simply taken my notes as the final warning before that erasure began. My body tensed, ready to abandon everything and save myself from the inevitable. But then, as the panic threatened to swallow me whole, other images rose in my mind. I saw the weary, scarred face of the old centurion, a man who had given his life to Rome and asked for nothing but honesty in return. I heard the anxious voice of the baker, his livelihood dependent on the whims of powerful men he would never meet. I felt the grit of the water from the public fountain and remembered the shared complaints of the women waiting in line. These were not just notes on a tablet. They were pieces of people's lives, small truths that formed a larger, more complex reality than any official history would ever admit. To run now would be to abandon them, to let their stories be stolen and silenced forever. My fear did not vanish. It remained, a cold knot in my stomach, a constant companion I knew I would carry from this day forward. However, something else settled alongside it, a stubborn, cold resolve. The naive scholar who arrived in Rome seeking intellectual challenge was gone, stripped away by this violation. In his place stood a man who understood the stakes and, to his own surprise, accepted them. They had taken my notes, but they had not taken the source. The stories were still out there, in the taverns and the workshops and the barracks. They had meant to frighten me into silence, but instead, they had shown me exactly how important my work truly was. I would not be erased.
I let the empty linen cloth fall from my fingers. I was no longer merely a historian documenting the present for the future. My task had shifted in the space of a heartbeat. Now I was a keeper of secrets, a protector of whispers against the powerful forces that sought to crush them. My mission was no longer one of simple documentation. It had become an act of preservation against a known and dangerous enemy. The full meaning of what had happened this night, I knew, would reveal itself not in days, but in the trials that were sure to come. The cold certainty that settled in my room was more terrifying than the immediate shock of the broken seal. They had not taken me, not yet. They had simply shown me their power, leaving my safe writings as a silent mockery of my efforts. Every moment I remained, the net was drawing tighter. My work, the real work, was a dead weight in my chest, a truth that would die with me if I did not act. I moved with a strange calm, pulling the scrolls from their hiding place beneath a loose floor tile. The papyrus felt heavy in my hands, each roll a condensed life. The baker's worries about the grain dole, the soldier's bitter complaints in the tavern, the centurion's quiet grief for lost comrades. These were not academic exercises. They were the city's pulse, and I was its only keeper. My first thought was of my patron, but the memory of his face, tight with fear as he warned me away from controversy, turned that idea to ash. He would burn the scrolls himself to protect his position. Then my mind turned to the senator on his grand hill. He would certainly take them, but he would not preserve them. He would twist their words, using the pain of common men as a weapon in his own silent war against Caesar. The stories would become nothing more than ammunition, their truth lost in the crossfire of ambition. I could not give the people's voices to men who only listened for echoes of their own power. I was utterly alone, adrift between the fear of my friends and the schemes of the powerful.
As I stood there,
Trapped by my own dangerous knowledge, my thoughts drifted from the cold marble of the Palatine Hill to the sun-warmed dirt of the Campus Martius. I saw a face, not of a scholar or a politician, but of the old centurion, a man whose features were a roadmap of campaigns in Gaul and Hispania, whose honor was not a thing to be debated in the Senate, but a simple, hard fact forged in battle. He had shared his stories with me not for gain, but simply because I had listened. He was a man of oaths and duty, loyal to the idea of Rome and the men who bled for it. In a city of shifting alliances, his loyalty felt as solid as the foundation of the Capitoline Temple. He was my only hope. The decision made, a new energy propelled me forward. I wrapped the scrolls in a thick, dark cloth and secured the bundle with leather cords, leaving my official, harmless notes scattered on my table as a decoy. I slipped out of my building, keeping to the narrowest alleys as dusk began to bleed purple and orange into the sky. I left the heart of the city behind, my sandals slapping on stone that gave way to packed earth paths at the city's edge. The familiar sounds of Rome, the endless rumble of carts and the murmur of crowds faded, replaced by the chirping of crickets and the rustle of wind through cypress trees. I walked toward a small, forgotten corner of the city, a place of quiet reverence where a soldier might go to speak to his gods without an audience. I found the place I was looking for, a humble garden temple, little more than a small stone altar sheltered by an olive tree. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and the sweet perfume of night-blooming jasmine. Worn river stones, smooth under my feet, formed a path around a small shrine dedicated to a minor god of soldiers' fortunes. It was a place of quiet faith, far from the grand rituals of the Forum. This felt right. A simple truth deserved a simple sanctuary. I clutched the bundle to my chest, my knuckles white, my breathing shallow, and waited in the growing shadows, hoping my judgment of this man was sound. He arrived as the last light of the sun vanished, a solid silhouette moving with the steady, measured pace of a lifelong soldier. He carried no weapon, only a small clay dish with a pinch of salt and grain, a humble offering. He did not seem to see me at first as he approached the altar, his attention focused inward. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This was the moment where my entire project, and likely my life, would be saved or lost based on a feeling, an instinct about a man's character. All my learning, all my careful methods had been stripped away, leaving only this raw, uncertain act of faith. Stepping from the shadows of the olive tree, I moved toward him. He turned, not with alarm, but with a soldier's immediate, calm assessment of a new presence. His hand did not go to a hidden dagger. He simply waited. I could not bring myself to say his name, nor did I offer my own. "I have something for you," I said, my voice barely a whisper, yet it seemed to echo in the stillness of the garden. "These are stories, the stories of your men, of the people. They are the truth, and they are in danger." I did not need to say from whom. The air itself seemed to carry that unspoken threat. I held out the bundle of scrolls. The surprising weight of it pulled at my arms, a physical representation of every risk I had taken. It was my life's work, everything I had suffered for, contained in a rough cloth package. For a long moment, he did not move. He just stood there, looking from my face, pale in the gloom, to the offering in my hands. The low, mournful call of a cuckoo broke the silence from a distant tree. I watched his eyes, the only part of him I could see clearly in the twilight, and I saw not confusion, but a flicker of grim understanding. He had spent his life listening to the unvarnished words of soldiers in their barracks and on the march. He knew the difference between official proclamations and the truth spoken from the heart. Then he gave a slow, single nod. It was a gesture of immense finality, an acceptance of a burden he did not have to take. Reaching out, his calloused hands took the bundle from mine. He did not ask what was in them, nor what he should do with them. He simply took them, his grip firm and sure. The transfer was complete. I felt a dizzying lightness as the weight left my hands, a feeling both of profound relief and of terrible loss. The pact was sealed without another word, a silent agreement between two men who believed something was worth saving. I turned and walked away without looking back. My empty satchel felt strange and useless, bumping against my leg with each step. The physical load was gone, lifted by the quiet strength of the centurion, but it was replaced by a different kind of heaviness. It was the immense, uncertain weight of the future, a future I could no longer see. I was walking back into the city that I knew was hunting me, but I felt no panic, only a strange and hollow calm. The stories were safe, and that was all that mattered now. As I blended back into the shadowed streets of Rome, I understood my journey had come to a strange end. I had set out as a historian, an observer, standing apart from the events I was recording, dedicated to capturing the truth. Now, my own survival had become a small, unwritten postscript, a footnote to the very history I had fought so hard to preserve. My purpose had been to document the soul of Rome, and in the process, I had risked my own in ways I could never have foreseen. The city around me carried on, unaware of the small drama that had just unfolded in a forgotten garden. Men drank wine in taverns, families prepared their meager evening meals, and sentries walked their lonely posts along the walls. I was just one more shadow moving through the darkness. I did not know if I would see the sunrise as a free man, if I would be sent to a fever-ridden outpost to be erased, or if a blade in a dark alley awaited me. But in that moment, it felt like a secondary concern. The truth was no longer in my hands. It was safe. My understanding of my life's work had been transformed. It was not merely about writing things down, but about ensuring the words themselves might one day live. And so, our time in the world of Julius Caesar draws to a quiet close. Beyond the marble forums and the Senate's decrees, Roman life unfolded with a familiar rhythm. Imagine the soft clink of pottery as a family finishes their evening meal,
the low murmur of conversation drifting from a nearby insula as lamplight flickers within. Under Caesar, the very calendar was reshaped, giving a new structure to the passing of seasons and the promise of a new day. A sense of grand, sweeping order was settling over their world, just as a quiet stillness now settles over yours. Let the echoes of their history fade into the background. May you find a deep and restorative peace, drifting into sleep as serenely as a citizen laying their head down to rest, confident in the coming dawn. Good night.